Hi, welcome to the Gemara on the bottom of Hamid Aleph through the first section, most of Hamid Bet. This is a review video only, so there's no homework in this video. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina. So Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Natan Etiyah B'Purim, Verachatz B'Krona Shel Tzipori B'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Put a comma there. Uvikesh La'akor Tisha B'Av. Velo Hodula. So Rebbe planted a plant on Purim. He washed himself in the shuk, like in public, in Sipori on Shiva Asar Tammuz, on that fast day, and he wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av, and they, meaning the other rabbis, did not allow him to do so. If you're wondering about the common theme of all these things that Rebbe did, it seems that these are all things that one would think that they should not be done. And one would think that they're not halachically appropriate things to do, and nonetheless, these are all things that Rebbe did. Amar Lefanav, Rabbi Abba bar Zavda. So Rabbi Abba bar Zavda said before him, meaning before Rabbi Elazar, who told this story, Rebbe, lo kach haya ma'aseh. My teacher, that's not what happened, that's not how the story went. Ella, Tisha b'Av shechal liyot b'Shabbat hava. V'dachinu la'achar Shabbat. Rather, it was Tisha B'Av that fell out on Shabbat, and they pushed it to after Shabbat, because as you already know, you can't move Tisha B'Av earlier, so if Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbat, you push it to the next day. So that was what happened in this case. The Amar Rebbe, and Rebbe said in that case, Hoil v'nidche, yidche. And Rebbe said in that case, so since it got pushed off, let's push it off, right? Since it already was pushed off because it couldn't happen on Shabbat, let's just skip it this year. Let's just push it off for this year. V'lo hodu chachamim, and the chachamim would not allow him to do that. And that's the way that Rabbi Abba bar Zavda retells the story. This is apparently the correct version of the story of what happened in terms of Rebbe and Tisha B'Av. Kari alei, he proclaimed upon him. He said about this, meaning now we're back to Rabbi Elazar said about Rabbi Abba bar Zavda's story. Tovim hashnayim min ha'achad. Two are better than one, or we might say in English, two heads are better than one. Yes, Rabbi Abba bar Zavda, it's a good thing that you remembered the story. You remembered it better than I did. Good to have two people remembering things and not just one. Moving on back to examining the first part of the story about Rebbe. For Rebbe, heichi natan etiyah b'Purim. And Rebbe, how could he plant a plant on Purim? How could he do such a thing? I'm going to put heichi in red as a question word here. How could he do such a thing? V'hatani, and wasn't it taught by Rav Yosef? V'hatani Rav Yosef. Simcha u'mishteh v'yom tov. The pasuk in Megillat Esther talks about simcha u'mishteh v'yom tov, happiness, parties, and yom tov, and a holiday. Simcha milamed she'asurim behesped. The word simcha teaches us that you can't have eulogies on Purim. Mishteh, the word mishteh, parties, teaches us that milamed she'asur b'ta'anit, teaches us that you're not allowed to fast on Purim. The Yom Tov, and the words Yom Tov, milamed she'asur b'asiyat melacha, teach us that you're not allowed to do melacha on Purim. Ella, Rebbe bar Beisar hava, v'chinata b'chameser nata. Rather, Rebbe was a son of the 14th, literally, meaning he was someone who celebrated Purim on the 14th by virtue of where he lived. And when he planted on the 15th, so there's no problem. Rebbe wasn't actually planting on Purim itself, so he didn't break this halacha, he didn't break this idea that we have Yom Tov on Purim. Ini, is this really so? Another great question word. Veha Rebbe b'Tzveria hava. But Rebbe was in Tzveria. V'Tzveria mukefet chomamim mot Yeshua ben Nun have. And Tzveria was encircled by a wall from the days of Yeshua ben Nun, meaning Rebbe should actually be a bar chameser. He should be someone who celebrates Purim on the 15th. So how can you get him off the hook by saying that he was planting on the 15th and celebrating on the 14th? Ella, Rebbe bar chameser hava. No, rather, in fact, Rebbe was someone who celebrated Purim on the 15th. V'chinata be'arbesar hava. And when he planted on the 14th. So same solution, we just switch it. Right? Whichever day he was planting wasn't the day that he actually celebrated Purim. Omi pshitale d'Tveria mukefet chamami Moshe Yeshua ben Nun. And is it really obvious that Tveria was encircled by a wall from the days of Yehoshua? Is that really the case? We'll do me as a question word as well. V'hachizkiya kari b'Tveria b'arbesar uv'chamesar. Mesafkale imu kefet chamami Yeshua ben Nun hi ila. But isn't it the case that Chizkiya, another Amora, another rabbi, would read in Tveria on the 14th and on the 15th because it was doubtful to him. He wasn't sure whether whether that city was walled from the days of Yehoshua or not. L'Chizkiya misafkale, l'Rebbe pshitale. Okay, fine. So Chizkiya wasn't sure, but for Rebbe it was obvious. Meaning Rebbe was allowed to act in accordance with what he thought was right, and he did in fact. So the fact that Chizkiya had doubts is not Rebbe's problem. V'chi pshitale mishari. And just because it was obvious to Rebbe which day Purim should be in Tveria, nonetheless, is it really allowed? Again, this word me, right? So chi pshitale, just because or since it is obvious to him, is it really permitted? Why not? V'haktiv b'Megillat Ta'anit et yom arba'a asar ve'et yom chamisha asar yome poraya inun v'lo mispad behun. But doesn't it say in Megillat Ta'anit? We'll talk about what Megillat Ta'anit is, but for now, just know it's another rabbinic text, another source within Chazal. So, isn't it written in Megillat Ta'anit? The 14th day and the 15th day are the days of Purim, and you can't have eulogies on them. The Amar Rava, and Rava said about this statement in Megillat Ta'anit, Lo nitzracha el surah et shel zeh b'zeh ve'et shel zeh b'zeh. Rava said this wasn't necessary, or this was only necessary, meaning the statement in Megillat Ta'anit was only necessary to forbid on one day that of the other day, and on the other day that of the first day. In other words, this teaches us that you should equate the 14th and 15th. It doesn't matter which day you celebrate Purim on. The Isurim of Purim apply equally to both days. You have to behave on the 14th as though it's Purim for someone else, and therefore you have to keep those Isurim. Hanimile, which would imply that Rebbe can't plant on Purim, no matter which day of Purim it is, even if he's already celebrated Purim. Hanimile behesped u'b'ta'anit, aval melacha yom echad v'tulo. Okay, those words are about eulogies and fasting, meaning the idea that you have to keep the restrictions on both days. That's only the restriction against eulogies and fasting. However, work, melacha, is a restriction yom echad, only one day, v'tulo, and no more. Okay? Whichever day you celebrate Purim, that's the day on which you have the melacha restriction, and not beyond that. Ini, this question word again, is this really so? V'harav chazilahu gavra to have a kashadi kitna b'poraya. V'lache v'lo tzamach kitna. But isn't it the case, didn't it happen that Rav saw some man who was planting flax on Purim? He was planting seeds on Purim, and he cursed him, and therefore the plant did not grow. So why would he have cursed him if it weren't usher to be planting at that point? So now the Gemara solves this problem. Hatam bar yoma have. No, in that case, he was planting actually on the day that he was supposed to be celebrating Purim. That's why he got cursed. He wouldn't have gotten cursed if he'd been someone who was supposed to celebrate Purim on the 14th and was planting on the 15th. He was actually in his day of Purim. Rabba Berei de Rava Amar. Rabba Berei de Rava, Rabba the son of Rava, has a different solution to offer. Afilatima biyome hesped v'tani kabilu alahu. Malachal lo kabilu alahu. No, you can even say that he was planting, meaning going back to the Rebbe story, you could even say he was planting on that day, on the day that he's supposed to celebrate Purim, because Hesped and Tanit, the restrictions against eulogies and fasting, the Jews accepted upon themselves, but Melacha they did not accept upon themselves. That's a restriction that they didn't accept upon themselves. Demi Karaktiv, because at the beginning or originally it's written in Esther, Simcha Mishtav Yom Tov, right? All those words that we looked at before. Ulavasov Ktiv, but later on, just a few psukim later, it says La'asot Tam Yimei Mishtav Simcha. It just says to make those days days of rejoicing, of partying and happiness. V'il Yom Tov lo Ktiv, but it doesn't say anything about Yom Tov, so clearly that one didn't last. Ve'ela Rav, however, Rav, my tama lachi lahahu gavra. Why did he curse that guy who was planting? Right? If Melacha wasn't accepted as a real restriction, why would he curse the guy who was planting seeds on Purim? And the answer is Dvarim hu mutarim. Oh, we'll put my tama in red. So the answer is Dvarim hu mutarim v'acharim nahagu behen isur. Hava uva'atri derebi lo nahug. Because these were things that were permitted. Right? It was actually permitted to do work on Purim, but others had a minhag to act as if it were asur, right? Different people had different minhagim in different places, and you should be respectful of that, and that's why he didn't like that he was planting. Uva atri de Rebbe lo nahug, but in Rebbe's location, they didn't have this minhag of refraining from work, and that's why it's okay that Rav cursed the guy who was planting, because presumably there he should have been sensitive to the minhag, but it's okay that Rebbe did plant because in his location there was no minhag to refrain from work. The ibayit ema, or if you want, you could say an alternative option for reading what happened. Lo lam nahug. No, in fact, it was accepted. It was practiced that you didn't do work on Purim. The Rebbe netiyah shel simcha nata, and Rebbe planted a happy tree, a planting of happiness. What does that mean? So kizitznan, as we learn in a Mishnah, avru elu v'lo na'anu b'ma'atin b'masa umatan b'binyan uvenetiyah be'irusin uvenesuin. If these pass, these here is referring to days that have been set aside as fasting for rain. So if these pass, v'lo na'anu, and they weren't answered, meaning rain has not come, then we reduce business, we reduce business dealings, we reduce building, and we reduce planting, and we reduce engagements and marriages. Right? We do fewer happy things. V'tana Allah, and it was further taught about this in a Tanaitic source. Binyan, building here is binyan shel simcha, is a building of happiness, a building that you build just out of joy. Netiyah in this context is netiyah shel simcha, is something that you plant just for happiness, meaning it's not an agriculturally significant act. It's not going to lead to any kind of parnasa, any kind of economic benefits. It's just you're just doing these things because you're happy. Ezohi binyan shel simcha. What is an example of a binyan shel simcha, a building of happiness? Zeh haboneh beit chatnut livno. Someone who builds a wedding house for his son. Right? That's something you do just because you're happy. Ezohi netiyah shel simcha, and what's an example of a planting of happiness? Zeh hanotea avornaki shel malachim. Someone who plants like a garden for kings, meaning a garden that's just for beauty, and it's just meant to be appreciated, but again has no agricultural significance. So we solved the problem. Rebbe was planting on Purim because he was planting in netiyah shel simcha, or you can go with one of these other interpretations and say that it wasn't the custom in his location to not plant on Purim. It wasn't the custom in his location to refrain from work because not everybody accepted that stringency or that restriction of not working on Purim. And we'll discuss in class how many of you have ever not worked B'shita, purposely not worked on Purim in order to fulfill it being a day of Yom Tov.